Professor Christopher Bae, thanks so much for coming back onto Evolution Soup all the way from your office in Mānoa, Hawaii. You are Professor of Anthropology and current Director of the Center for Korean Studies, University of Hawaii, and your main interests center around the human evolutionary record in East Asia and all its intriguing species, especially those discovered in recent years. Last time we covered the Asian hominin muddle in the middle, including the new and unifying species, Homo juluensis. It's only been a short time since you've proposed this species name, Chris, but it certainly is getting a lot of attention, isn't it?
Yeah, actually, it is getting a lot of attention. And first of all, I want to thank you, Mark, for the invitation to come back. Homo juluensis, when we published it, we anticipated that there would be pushback. Not everybody would agree generally with it, but that's part of science and the way science works, right? You put an idea out there, and then you see what happens with it. But I think for the most part, in the Nature Communications paper, we had a pretty good grouping of the fossils that we think belong in the hypodyme for juluensis, and I haven't seen too much opposition in terms of how we group the fossils, regarding that. And I'm starting to see juluensis in print now, so it seems to be picking up speed. But regarding the opposition, I think I probably mentioned this earlier in the earlier interview, but there's probably two parties that really don't necessarily agree with what's going on with juluensis. And one is in our Nature Communications paper, and in the original hypodyme, we talked about assigning the Denisovan fossils to juluensis based on similarities, particularly with the teeth. The teeth, especially the molars, are pretty much interchangeable between Denisova and Shijiao. So I think some Western paleoanthropologists, though, are a little hesitant to want to call the Denisovan fossils by a Chinese name, because Denisova, everybody knows who Denisovans are, simply because they've been in the print for so long now, for the past 15 years. And so we figured that there would be some opposition to that. But I think as time goes by, people will really buy into the idea that Denisova itself was never actually a name. It's just the name of a population, and whether it should be accepted as a species name or not is another story. But I think people will buy into Denisovans being assigned to a Chinese name. Whether it's juluensis or not is another story again. And then the other opposition is probably a smaller opposition. Is Homo longi has also been proposed based off of the Harbin skull, and you've actually done an interview, I think, earlier when Homo longi came out. And so the proponents of Homo longi want to assign the Denisovans to the Homo longi hypodyme, and so I think those proponents are suggesting that juluensis doesn't work for this reason and that reason, simply because they want to assign the Denisovan fossils to Homo longi. But when you think about the Homo longi fossil itself, and then you think about the Denisovan fossils, there's nothing connecting them. So there's no molars that are the same that you can do a comparative analysis. So it's really about smoothing the data to be able to say that you look at my data results, and it suggests that the Denisovan should be assigned to Homo longi. But I think most paleoanthropologists tend to be a little conservative in this aspect, where they say that you should at least have some fossils that connect each other. So you should have some molars from Homo longi, and then some molars from Denisova, and do the comparative analysis, and then figure it out from there. So I think, though, from what I've heard, is that most people seem to agree with the grouping itself, whether you want to call them juluensis or not, or whether you want to assign them to call the Chinese fossils Denisovans. It's going to be ultimately come down to a matter of opinion.
Well, today we're going to be talking about one of the most famous and the most contentious tales in scientific history, the discovery and mysterious disappearance of the Peking Man hominid fossils. This is a story with a lot of twists and turns, so before we dig deep into the world of Peking Man, can you give us an overview of what exactly this fossil is, when it was found, and why it's so important?
Sure. It's actually interesting that you asked me to talk about this because half of my dissertation project was focused on Jukutien, and so material from Jukutien. So I actually, as a Western paleoanthropologist, I know a lot more about the history of Jukutien than most most people, except probably the people in the IVPP, the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, where I also ended up doing my postdoc there as well. Jukutien, has a very, very long history. It was initially discovered in the early 1920s, and fieldwork was done there. And some of this stuff was actually discussed a little bit during the earlier interview about the muddle in the middle. But uh, in the late 1800s, there was an idea that Asia could be considered to be the cradle of mankind. And so this is what led to people like Roy Chapman Andrews organizing the Central Asiatic expeditions and doing field work in Mongolia and stuff. Uh, but what people were really interested in finding were the so-called missing link at the time, right? Because nobody really knew what the missing link would be. And if you look at the skull here, this is a skull of a cast of a modern human. It's got the globular shape. It has a receding brow ridges, very, very reduced brow ridges, a very orthognathic face, right? Uh, but what's interesting is, this is a cast of a chimpanzee, and so if you look at the chimpanzee, the lateral view of the chimpanzee, you look at the lateral view of the modern human, they look quite different. And so, you know, in the 1800s and into the early 1900s, people were really interested in looking for the quote unquote missing link, something that would be between ape and human. And so, people had suggested, Asia could be an area that would be really viable as a place where, we might be able to find this missing link. You think about Eugene Dubois in the late 1880s and early 1890s, where he actually found fossils that look like this from Sangaran in Indonesia, because he specifically went to Indonesia to be able to look for fossils. And he actually found something that was really important in the early 1890s. But then he submitted the report, to the Western scientific community, based in mostly in Europe at the time, and they flat out rejected, his idea, saying that there's no way that you're going to find the missing link in a place like Southeast Asia. And then you had Piltdown, come up in the backyard of, right outside of London, right? And so people started to kind of buy into that, and saying that if you're going to find the missing link, it should be in Europe, and why not a better place than in England, right outside of London. So, but obviously, with Piltdown, there was also opposition to that, because it really didn't make any sense to a lot of people. But it was an interesting story that people did tend to buy into. But then people were also interested in sites in China, not just the Central Asiatic expeditions, but people became really interested in looking for fossils in China, which we'll talk about them in a little bit. But people started to realize that, not too far outside of Beijing, you start to find uh, fossils, where if you find fossils of other animals, there's a chance that you're going to find fossils of early humans, and some that could potentially be a missing link. And so that's what really got people interested in actually living and working in places like China, to be able to find these fossils. So the reason why Yucatan actually came on the radar, is because they did extensive field work beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, where they actually found a whole series of skull caps and a lot of other material And they found the remains of between 40 and 50 individuals of who came to be eventually known as Homo erectus. And that's the reason why Jupitan came on the radar of a lot of people at the very beginning of the field work there.
Well, there are a lot of twists and turns of this story, as I've said, and it all begins with something called dragon bones, isn't that right?
Yeah, dragon bones have a long history in Asia. The idea is that fossils have medicinal properties. And so if you go, in traditional Asian culture, many traditional Asian cultures, and so, if you go to local apothecary shops, traditional Chinese medicine stores, you will find fossils in the background and then, in the drawers. And so what they'll do is they'll actually grind them up into powder and they'll tell you how to eat it. Either you put the powder and you mix it in with hot water and you drink it down. And it's supposed to cure everything and anything that's wrong with you. And so a lot of, especially a lot of people from the countryside, they have a tendency to believe and still believe that these fossils, if you grind them up and you drink them down or inhale them or whatever, they will have medicinal purposes. So they'll cure things like cancer or rheumatoid arthritis, things like that. Uh, so paleontologists, not only Western paleontologists coming to places like China for the first time, but paleontologists even in China know about the importance of these apothecary shops because if you're going to look for fossils and you're sitting in your office in Beijing, you really have no idea where to go start looking for these fossils, right? And me sitting in my office in Manoa in Hawaii, and I'm trying to look for fossils in say southern China. I also have no idea, where in the world I'd start looking. So the idea is that we would go and explore some of these, visit these apothecary shops and find out which ones actually have real fossils that might be of interest to us. And then sometimes you'd have to bribe the owner, the doctors there, or just become friends with them and talk to them, and then you could find out where their sources are for where they actually got these fossils from. And probably one of the most famous examples of dragon bones discoveries is von Koningswald was visiting some apothecary shops in southern China, and he actually came across the original Gigantopithecus teeth. And Gigantopithecus is so large that the teeth really stood out immediately to an anatomist like von Koningswald. And so he obviously bought them. He identified them as a new species, and then they started to find these Gigantopithecus fossils in other areas of southern China as a result. But this is why it's important to not only have relations with, for someone like me based in Manoa, to also have relations with people in the big cities in China, but then you need to be able to go out to the countryside and spend time out there. Even at the, even you go to the provincial level, and then you go to the county level, and then ultimately what you're doing is you're going to eventually get the people at the county level to talk to the people at the village level to be able to introduce you to these areas and stuff. Because having mapping and stuff like that is fine and dandy, but it's really like the local farmers, the local villagers who really know exactly where the caves are that you're looking for, and they'll know where the fossils are. So you look at a place like Bubing Basin in Guangxi in southern China, where I spent a lot of time working. It's impossible for us to really know where the caves are. It would take us probably like 10 times longer to be able to find some of these caves and fossils if we didn't have the relations with the local villagers. Because when you talk to the local villagers, one of the things that they'll say is, "Oh yeah, we have this cave in our backyard where when we were kids we would go and catch the bats that were in the caves, and we catch them and then fry them up and eat them." But we also dug out the cave as well because we knew that there were fossils there, and we could sell the dragon bones to the medicinal stores, the medicine shops in town. So, once you have the connections, the relations with the local villages, it's a lot easier to be able to find the locations of these, you know, the origin of these so-called dragon bones.
Interested parties from all over the world descended upon the Jikutian site: paleontologists, geologists, teachers, students. But who were the main figures in this race to name and claim these intriguing fossils?
It's a good question. There's so many different people involved with the field work and the lab work at Jukutien. You think about the history of the site itself. If it wasn't for paleontologists and geologists like Otto Zadansky and Gunnar Anderson in the late 19 teens who started field work in the region, what happened is that the local villagers, brought this site called Chicken Bone Hill, to the attention of these paleontologists and these geologists, and they said that there's probably pretty good evidence, for the types of fossils that you guys are looking for, at this site called Chicken Bone Hill. And then once they started doing research at Chicken Bone Hill, the local villages also said, if you guys are interested in these fossils, you might find this other area, this other hill, to be really, really interesting, even more important because there's actually even a lot more fossils there. And that site eventually became, it eventually became Jukutien. And so the paleontologists and geologists eventually went there and started doing field work, and they started to find all these fossils and stuff. And so people like Zadansky and Anderson, they brought this material to the attention of Davidson Black, who was actually a Canadian, who was interested in human evolution in Asia, and he moved to Asia and China specifically to start searching for, to answer questions related to human evolution. And people don't realize this, but Davidson Black was also interested in, in being involved with the Central Asiatic expeditions, with Roy Chapman Andrews and stuff. And so they were thinking about carrying out similar types of field projects and stuff in Western China, but it was so politically unstable at the time, as that's the reason why the Central Asiatic expeditions ended. But it was so politically unstable at the time that they gave up. And then they found out that there were all these fossils at this site called Jukutien. Now, so Davidson Black was the primary person that was in charge of the Jukutien excavations, field work, and lab work. He's credited with getting the permission to create the Cenozoic Research Laboratory, which eventually became the IVPP, the present day IVPP in the 1960s. So the problem with Davidson Black is he had serious health issues, and he eventually had died in 1934 of a heart attack. And so he wasn't able to really fulfill all of the field work and everything, all of his dreams regarding reconstructing human evolution in Asia as a result of that. Uh, but after Davidson Black died, Franz Weidenreich, a German who moved to America because of the problems with the Nazis in Germany, eventually was recruited and then hired in to replace Davidson Black. And then, so Franz Weidenreich is also a very big name, in the history of Jukutien research. So we can talk more about, Weidenreich and Davidson Black as well in a little bit when we talk about the actual materials and findings. So on the Chinese side, Pei Wenzhong is often credited with being really the grandfather of Chinese paleoanthropology. And he started working at the Jukutien site when he was in his early 20s. He was like fresh out of college, and so he was working there. He was working with Davidson Black, and then he was working with Franz Weidenreich. So Pei Wenzhong was highly influential in developing paleoanthropology as a viable field and really important field in China. And a lot of it stems from the research that he was doing at Jukutien.
The Peking Man fossil caves have been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most important paleoanthropological sites in the world, now boasting a museum. Chris, what exactly was found at this site, and what were the early scientific conclusions that resulted from those initial digs?
The reason why Jukutin is known everywhere is because they found the remains of species that came to be known as Homo erectus, and so initially they started to find thousands upon thousands of vertebrate fossils, and so I think in 1926 they found a couple of teeth, and Davidson Black identified these teeth and he said that these are not human. And so these could actually be the missing link. And so he, that very year, or the very next year, he proposed a new species, Sinanthropus pekinensis. Sin for China, and then anthropos meaning for human, and then pekinensis meaning Peking, right? So and so this is where the name came from, but it was actually from based off of just a couple of teeth at the time, and so it wasn't readily accepted initially because it's very hard to develop a new species based off of one or two teeth. Uh, but soon after that, though, starting in the late 1920s, they started to find, fairly complete skull caps of something that did not look like a modern human at all, and clearly was not a chimpanzee. So it was clearly different, right? And so it led to some further justification for the new species, Sinanthropus pekinensis. And so at the site, because they continued to do a lot of field work and research at Yucatan, the site itself is actually located only 50 kilometers southwest of Beijing. And so it's within, at the time there's no highways or anything like that, and so it would take basically like a half a day to get out there by train, or by taxi to get out there. But it was considered to be relatively close to the capital city at the time, and so that's part of the reason why it received so much attention because it was readily accessible for people to get out there. Nowadays, with driving and the highways and everything, it only takes you about an hour and a half to get out there. So, but Jukutian itself, it's actually Jukutian. Locality one is the one that's the best known because this is the one that has all the Homo erectus fossils. But Jukutian actually has 26 different localities. And so the most famous locality is Jukutian Locality 1, where all the Homo erectus fossils are found. This came to be later known as the cave home of Peking Man, right? Which is something I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. But other localities that became famous as well are Jukutian Upper Cave. Jukutian Upper Cave is literally located above Locality 1, and so Jukutian Upper Cave was found in 1930 when they were doing field work at Locality 1. And they carried out two field seasons at Upper Cave in 1933 and 1934, where they found the remains of human burials. And so the material found at Jukutian Upper Cave, which is located up here, and Locality 1 are completely different, right? And then another major locality at Jukutian is Jukutian Locality 15, and this was considered to be representative of quote unquote Middle Paleolithic at the time, and so this also became very well known as well to the scientific community. Another site, which is actually not part of the Jukutian localities, but it's called Tianyuan Dong, Tianyuan Cave. It's located about 5 kilometers away from Jukutian. But this site was discovered in the early 2000s, so really recent. And it was a fairly intact skeleton of a adult individual male. And that they think may have been the result of a burial, dates to about 40,000 years ago. And so it's interesting that they have a lot more field work at this site there. They're finding fossils that are important to paleoanthropology in the region. Yeah, so Jukutian Locality 1, it's pretty interesting because you're looking at about 40 meters of deposits where they found Homo erectus fossils throughout. And so one of the first questions that paleoanthropologists ask when they find fossils is how old is this material, right? And so the initial studies, the initial dating studies that were done in the 70s and 80s, they came out with age reconstruction at the uppermost layers. You've got fossils that date to about 220,000 years ago. And the lowermost layers with fossils, you've got date to about 550,000 years ago. And so if you look at most textbooks for Jukutian that talk about Jukutian Locality 1, they will tell you that the age range is between about 220,000 and about 550,000 years ago, so about 300,000 years. So, and it became entrenched in the literature and in discussions, at conference talks and stuff like that. Probably starting in the 1990s, though, other geochronologists started to look at this stuff, and they realized that we can do other dating methods and apply them to the site. And so nowadays, people think that the youngest deposits probably date to about 400,000 years ago, and the oldest deposits at locality 1 probably date to about 800,000 years ago. So everything got shifted from 220 to 550 down to about 400,000 to about 800,000 years ago. And it also added about another 100,000 years of occupation history. So we're talking about the early part of the Middle Pleistocene or the Chibanian for the occupation period for locality 1. There are other localities, as I mentioned earlier. There's 26 total localities at Jukutian, and so there are early Pleistocene, so earlier, older than 800,000 years, localities there. And then you've got sites like Jukutian Upper Cave, which are from the late Pleistocene, that have modern human fossils that were, the result of burials, but these date to between about 30 and 40,000 years ago. So there's a wide range of ages for the Jukutian localities, but for the cave home of Peking Man right now, it dates to between about 400,000 and about 800,000 years ago. But getting back to Jukutian Locality 1, which is the focus of this discussion here, you know, they have found tens of thousands of vertebrate fossils at the site. They have found tens of thousands of lithic artifacts at the site. They have also said that they found very thick ash layers, and so they argue that this was also evidence of early fire, in situ fire, at locality 1. And so if you think about all of this evidence, it was argued by early researchers that this is clearly the cave home of Peking Man. And so if you think about the idea of a cave home or a quote unquote home base, this is a spot where Homo erectus was assumed to have gone hunting outside and then brought the deer, that they killed from that they hunted down and killed, and then brought back to the site. It was processed. They made stone tools. They had fire in place, and this is where they spent most of their time. And so that's why it was called Cave Home Peking Man. So the Chinese, you look at Chinese textbooks, up through the 1990s, it all said that this is the cave home of Peking Man. This is our ancestral origins for present day, modern day Chinese. And so it's interesting. So it became really a national heritage site, and then eventually it became a UNESCO site. And so it's really, really important. So the only issue, though, is that when Westerners started to look at the material, from locality 1, they started to raise a lot of questions, about some of the interpretations about whether this could really be called, the cave home of Peking Man, and everything that's related to the idea of a cave home or a home base, right? And so some of the examples are, in the 1980s, there was a famous archaeologist by the name of Louis Spinford who went to Beijing and looked at some of the vertebrate fossils from locality one, and he concluded that what he looked at were really just the heads of the animals. And so, if you kill an animal, you're probably not going to take the head back home unless that you're going to probably want to take back like the leg bones and the limbs, right, and then the body, the torso of the carcass, because it contains the most meat and marrow. So, uh, what Binford and his colleagues were doing is that they realized that it was really a head dominated assemblage. And so, what they argued is that Homo erectus from locality one, Peking Man, was actually not a really good hunter at all, but he was probably just a scavenger. So, other carnivores were killing the animals outside, and then Peking Man was scavenging whatever's left over, which ended up being like the heads of these animals, and then transporting the heads back to the cave and processed there. And so, as you might imagine, since China and the Chinese government has said that this is a really important site, this is a national heritage site, and clearly we have our ancestral origins and roots, that go back to Peking Man, if not even further back in time. And so it became a real big major debate in the field about whether Peking Man was capable of hunting or whether he was only capable of scavenging. Because even today, people, if you think about paleoanthropologists and the way that we interpret the data, if you're only capable of scavenging and not hunting, there's a certain degree of cognitive level that's involved within, and so people say that you're more intelligent if you're capable of hunting well, as opposed to only being able to scavenge, because hunting takes some planning and things like that, that are involved, and so a higher degree of of intelligence. So that came under fire. The idea that the animal bones were actually the result of scavenging as opposed to hunting. Whether I can talk about it in a little bit as well, but the primary problem with that whole argument is that um, Binford, when he came in the 1980s, was able to look at the material, but what happened is that the IVPP has physically moved their location several times since its origin, right? So the current place, where it's located right now, is not where it was originally in the 1920s. And so what happened is that when you move, and you think about yourself when you move, you end up getting rid of stuff, stuff that you may not think is very important, right? And so the stuff that they had a tendency to retain are stuff, like the antlers of the deer and the heads, right, the skulls. Uh, but the limb bones, like if you've got fragmented femora and humeri, that are really identifiable but may not seem very important. They would often get left behind or just lost in the shuffle. And so these types of fossils, the limb bones are actually really really important, but they apparently were lost or not made available to Binford for his research, or he probably would have had a different interpretation of whether Peking Man was a scavenger or a capable hunter or not. Um, my own personal opinion on this particular topic is I think that there's pretty good evidence nowadays that Homo erectus was actually a really good and capable hunter. And so if you look at the limb bones, you can see that there's a lot of marks on the bones as well that would indicate that these guys were probably pretty good, apex predators basically at that time, if not apex predators, close to it. So, so that's a hypothesis that was tested, it was refuted, and then it was, retested. And I think most people nowadays probably believe that Peking Man was probably capable of killing, they're literally like the remains of more than 3,000 deer, from locality one. And so, you think about, locality one's a really large site. And so you think about all these deer remains, um, you know, they had to have been brought into the cave somehow, right? So That's one of the major questions regarding locality one. Another major question is ash. You know, whether Peking Man was actually capable of making fire or not. You know, because the early researchers said that you've got literally like a meter thick layer of ash at the site. And so in the 1990s, some Western scientists who actually specialize in identifying ash from archaeological layers, from archaeological sites, went and collected samples and looked at the sediment and the samples and said that there's actually no evidence of in situ fire at locality one. And so these thick, darkened supposed purported ash layers were actually discoloration from water lane deposits. So water is creeping in and then sitting there for a long period of time. And then the water eventually evaporates and gets removed. And so it looks like black ash, right? But when you actually look at it, it's just a really dark, silty sand. So so that was kind of refuted. A lot of researchers who've made a name for themselves saying that Peking Man built in situ campfires at the site. Didn't like it, but we're still waiting to see evidence for that. So that's still out there as a possibility. But my guess is that Homo erectus Peking Man probably had some in situ fire. But as I tell my classes all the time, if you're a very mobile hunter-gatherer and you build a campfire for one day and then you leave the next day, the chance of finding any evidence of a campfire, literally hundreds of thousands of years later, is probably not going to be there, right? So, it's quite possible that Homo erectus was probably making fire, but was really only staying there temporarily. So another major area that's come under question or debate in the field about locality one is the idea that early on Franz Weidenreich suggested that Peking Man was cannibalistic. And so he looked at the fossils and he said that there's these evidence of these marks on the skull caps that suggested to him that they were killing each other and then eating each other, right? And so the question about whether Homo erectus was cannibalistic or not was a long-term debate in the field. In the 1990s, some Western paleoanthropologists went and looked at the fossils, and well, they didn't actually look at the fossils. They looked at the casts of the fossils, and this is something we'll talk about in a little bit. But they looked at the casts of the fossils, and then one of the things that they realized by looking at the surfaces of you look at the surfaces of the fossils, they started to find these grooves and stuff on the edges. And when they looked at it under microscope, they said that these actually look like carnivore tooth marks biting down on the skulls themselves. And so they suggested that rather than this being cannibalistic behavior where Peking Man, the Homo erectus were killing each other, it's quite possible that carnivores were actually, coming around and killing or at least consuming the Homo erectus that were found in the cave. And so this obviously became, a major debate as well in the field because, for 70 odd years, it was a long-term idea that Peking Man was cannibalistic. And so these Western paleoanthropologists come in and say, there's actually little to no evidence of, cannibalism here, but rather than cannibalism, basically what we're really looking at are carnivores, other carnivores, chewing on the Homo erectus fossils remains. So, but I do want to point out though that these Western paleoanthropologists were actually looking at the surfaces of the casts, and if you're looking at second generation, third generation casts, something always gets lost in the shuffle, so to speak, right? And so you really need to take with a grain of salt, analysis of surface modification of casts. And so it's not really clear, what marks are actual legitimate marks that were left on the fossils themselves that also appear in the casts themselves. So I think it's not clear whether, Homo erectus was cannibalistic or not, or whether these fossils were brought to the cave by other carnivores. So it's another major debate in the field.
Today, the hominids found in those early excavations have been designated as Homo erectus. And as with your own grouping of various large-headed Asian fossils into the new name Homo juluensis, this was to simplify an ever-growing human family tree. But this didn't exactly happen overnight, did it?
No, not at all. It's this gets into questions about lumping and splitting. Lumpers have a tendency to emphasize similarities, so they want to call everything, in fewer categories or groupings, as opposed to splitters who have a tendency to emphasize differences or variation, and then they want to split it out into different species. Uh, up through probably about 1950, paleoanthropologists were pretty much splitters. They were splitting everything, and that was simply because we were finding all these fossils, and we didn't know the actual range of variation for all these fossils. And you think about it, in the 1920s and 1930s, it wasn't like I could just reach out to somebody working in Indonesia and say, can you send me some photos of your fossils, and get on the phone or send an email, or send a text message or through social media nowadays, right? So it was very difficult to do an actual comparative analysis, and so you had a lot of splitting going on up through about 1950, where you've got, and this is not just Asia, it's Africa, and Europe as well, where you've got all of these different names that were proposed out there. And ultimately, when you started to look at places like the African record and the European record, you had some lumping going on there, because they realized that a lot of these so-called different species are actually can be easily assigned to the same hypodyne. So in the case with Peking Man, when Davidson Black proposed the name Sinanthropus pekinensis, there was another name out there, Eugene Dubois, in the early 1890s, identified, proposed the name Pithecanthropus erectus. And so there was Pithecanthropus erectus for Southeast Asia, and then there was Sinanthropus for Northeast Asia for the Chinese fossils. So in the late 1930s, after Franz Weidenreich took over for Davidson Black, he invited von Koningswald up to Beijing, and to bring his fossils from Indonesia. And so they did a comparative analysis, the fossils from the Sinanthropus fossils from China, and then the Pithecanthropus fossils from Indonesia, and they realized that these are probably just regional variants of the same species, right? And so at the time they didn't really do much further with it in terms of like saying we should lump these into one species and then just use one species name. But there was a major conference at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island in New York in 1950, and Ernst Mayr talking about human evolution, and Ernst Mayr, who was already really famous back then in 1950, but wasn't a paleoanthropologist. His background is obviously in ornithology, right? But he was big into systematics, and he said, you know what, there are so many different hominid species out there. It's probably really time that we need to start reining this in, and maybe we should start lumping some of these different species, these different fossils into similar species. And so he proposed the name Homo erectus, and he proposed at that time to lump the Sinanthropus and the Pithecanthropus fossils into Homo erectus. And paleoanthropologists said, you know what, that actually makes sense. And so this is where the name Homo erectus comes about. And after that, Sinanthropus and Pithecanthropus, those names started to go by the wayside. They're no longer, they're still used in colloquial terms and stuff, but we don't really call anybody, we don't find a new fossil and identify it as Pithecanthropus erectus or Sinanthropus pekinensis. if we find a fossil that we think is related to Homo erectus, we'll just call it Homo erectus. But this is how the names come about there. And so the field kind of shifted to kind of like not lumping, but almost super lumping, where you've got a lot of these fossils, being lumped into these broader categories. This is where like Homo heidelbergensis came about as kind of like replacing the name of archaic Homo sapiens, but kind of lumping all these different groups, these different species into one species. Uh, but right now, with the the field work, that's going on in Asia right now, and the discovery and reanalysis of these old fossils and the discovery of new fossils is pretty amazing because we're finding so much more variation, in the hominid fossil record, especially from the Middle Pleistocene, this time period. And so, we're actually right now probably at a point where we have a tendency to split right now. And so we're splitting, these different fossils into different species where, eventually they may, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, they may eventually get lumped back into one species. But right now, we're just becoming aware of the amount of variation that's in the Asian hominid fossil record. And so there's actually a lot of splitting going on as a result.
Those initial fossils that caused such a stir in the scientific world are now represented by casts that fortunately were made at that time. The original fossils have been lost for many decades, and the loss of those bones is, to this day, one of the biggest mysteries known to the scientific community. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's actually pretty amazing. Jukutian locality one is known for the presence of between 40 and 50 individuals. So you're talking about several hundred fossils, and what happened is that, at the beginning of the United States' entry into World War II, so right after Pearl Harbor, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States declares war on Japan. Japan declares war on the United States, and Germany does as well. Uh, Japan was already at war with China. They took over Manchuria, northeast China, and they were invading many different major cities along the eastern seaboard. They were in Beijing. And so a lot of Westerners and a lot of Chinese paleoanthropologists, scientists realize that these fossils are really, really important. But if Japan takes over, invades Beijing and takes over our laboratories, they're going to take these fossils, and who knows what they're going to do with them. And these are national treasures, these fossils. So they finally, after much discussion, one of the original ideas was to actually move the fossils west, uh, you know, and maybe to Chengdu or someplace out west that really out of the reach of the Japanese. And so, but that idea was rejected because it was still even in that region, it was still unstable as well. So finally, the Western paleoanthropologists, got permission to ship the fossils and the really important stuff to the American Museum of Natural History in New York for the duration of the war. Now, the reason why we know so much about the fossils is because Franz Weidenreich made a lot of detailed records and casts and stuff. So that's an important point that we'll come back to in a few minutes. But so the story has it that they packed all of the really important fossils into a couple of military trunks, put it on a train, with a U.S. military guard, and then shipped on the train to the port city Tianjin, and then from there it was supposed to be, put on a U.S. military vessel to then go back to the United States. But the story has it that the military vessel was actually grounded at the beginning of U.S.'s formal entry into the war. So the military vessel never actually arrived in the port city. So there's no way that the crates could have actually been put on the ship because the ship was already grounded. So, but the story has it that the crates never actually arrived in Tianjin. So it's not clear what happened to the crates. And so, one idea, is that the crates uh, did actually arrive in Tianjin, but then they were, for the duration of the war, they were actually left in a warehouse. And then people after the war were looking for the fossils and couldn't find the crates in these warehouses. Another hypothesis that has been proposed is that the Japanese military intercepted the train, which they did. There's evidence of that. And then they actually took the crates off of the train, and then nobody knows what happened to them at that time. The rumor has it is that the Japanese military, realizing how important that the material was, they actually took the material back to Tokyo, and then they would be there in Japan for the duration of the war. Um, the problem with that, though, is that after the war, when the Allies were going through, in Tokyo, and they were actually going through trying to repatriate materials and stuff, they actually found some material from sites like Jukuti and Upper Cave, which is much more recent in time. They found some artifacts and stuff, and they repatriated those materials back to Beijing, but the Homo erectus fossils, the Peking Man fossils, were never found in Japan. So the other another idea or story was that the Japanese military unloaded the crates from the train after they intercepted it, and simply destroyed the fossils, at that time, not realizing how important or significant the fossils were. So, but the story itself actually gets even more interesting because some U.S. sources have said that the fossils actually made it to New York. There was a businessman based in Chicago, Christopher Janis, who became really interested in these, the location of these fossils, and so put up a reward, for any information regarding the location of these fossils. And so a woman reached out to him and said that she has the fossils, but she wants to meet him in an open area because she was worried about being spied on. And so they agreed to meet at the top of the Empire State Building. And so Janice met this woman, and she showed him a photo of some fossils sitting or at least some bones in a crate. But apparently, according to the story, the woman was very scared and worried about being spied on. She thought some Asian tourists nearby who were taking photographs were actually taking photographs with her, and so she got cold feet and ran away. And so Janice never got to meet her again, and didn't know what to make of it as well. So there are many stories regarding what actually happened to the Peking Man fossils, and it's not clear what happened to them. I always propose to my students. I say, if you guys are interested in doing something related to this for a dissertation project, it would be pretty amazing if you could actually figure out where the fossils are. So there was a couple of publications that came out only a couple of years ago. So within like the last 2 or 3 years that came out, where they actually analyzed the photo, the photo that supposedly had these fossils, the Peking Man fossils in the crate. And what they concluded is that these are bones, human bones that are actually in the crate, but they're not fossils, and they're definitely not those of Homo erectus. So it seems clear that a lot of people had different stories, and different ideas, and part of it was related to money, because people like Christopher Janis was proposing, offering these really big rewards There was somebody based in Taiwan who said that he had the fossils in Taiwan and reached out to the curator from the American Museum of Natural History, Shapiro, and said he would give them up for, I think 500,000 or $1 million, and so nothing ever came of that as well, because, not many people have that kind of money lying around. Yeah, so when I was a postdoc in the IVPP, and I was talking to my colleagues, they would suddenly say, "Oh, I have to go down to Yunnan this weekend," and I would say, "Why?" And they said, "Well, a local farmer said they may have the Peking Man fossils, and so we need to go check it out to see if they're actually the fossils or not." So I was like, "Oh, wow, that's quite interesting." Uh, 99.9% of the time, these local farmers are finding like cow bones or deer bones or pig bones or something. But if there's no specialists out, in the local counties or provincial level, they really have to go out there to take a look at it. Um, Nobody really knows where the Peking Man fossils are. I myself, I think that the Peking Man fossils may actually be behind me right here, but otherwise it's a joke. It's a joke, right? So, but I really think that the Peking Man fossils probably never left China. And so they probably, if they haven't been destroyed and sold to apothecary shops and ground up for medicine, they probably got lost someplace, and so it's really unfortunate, but it's interesting because they started to renew field work in locality one in the 60s, and they actually found a hominid fossil in the 60s that could refit with a hominid fossil from the 1930s. So it says that there's actually still a lot of potential for more research at sites like Locality One.
Well, study of the Peking Man site and remaining fossils are still being scrutinized today. So, how is the research going, and what are the latest findings on these fossils?
There's still a lot of potential at sites like Locality One. As I mentioned earlier, they were able to find refit a fossil that was found during fieldwork in the 60s to a fossil that was actually excavated, discovered in the 30s. So there's a lot of potential at sites like Locality One. There's still some of the original deposits left there, and they're waiting for new technologies, new methods, new approaches to be able to apply them, to be able to see if there's anything more to do at the site. About 20 years ago, there was a French team that brought in ground penetrating radar to actually go over the Chukutian Hill to see if they can find any new cavities or caves there. And they actually did find some areas that look like there's potential, there. So the potential to find more Peking Man fossils at Yucatan is still quite high. So it's pretty interesting there. Other research that's still ongoing. If you think about Yucatan Upper Cave, which I had mentioned earlier, that's associated with modern humans. Uh, when this site was found in 1930, and that was excavated in 33 and 34, people weren't really sure about the age, but they knew that they found human burials, and they found necklaces of like perforated animal teeth and shells and stones and things like that, that probably were worn by the deceased when they were buried. So the problem though is they didn't really know how old these humans were. They knew that they were modern humans, but they didn't know exactly how old they were, and so most of the people that were doing the research there said that, you know what, this site probably dates to the Holocene, probably, or the Pleistocene Holocene transition, so probably only about 10,000 years ago. Uh, the Chinese have said that the material is probably much older, but Westerners have said that it was probably from the Pleistocene Holocene transition. So we looked at the material, and several years ago we actually published a paper that has been receiving a lot of attention nowadays. But we redated we dated some new material from the site that we think we're found in association, or at least we're fairly confident we're found in association with the human burials. And the dates came out to between 30 and 40,000 years ago. So, if you think about, these are really early dates for human burials in East Asia, because you don't find anything, that can be definitely the equivalent of a human burial so far, until about 40,000 years ago. But these are really early dates for that. So, there's still new research and new approaches going on to, at sites like Jukutian Locality 1, Jukutian Upper Cave, reanalyses of like the stone tools and the paleontology from these other localities as well. That's really, just the fact that there are literally tens of thousands of artifacts and fossils, at Jukutian is really, it allows us to do a lot of comparative analyses, to be able to, understand the broader human evolutionary picture.
Well, it's such an incredible story, one I've wanted to dive into on this channel for a very long time. And I'm very grateful that you've been able to come back onto the show to talk about it today. So, what's next for you, Chris? Any field work coming up or perhaps a book?
There's always research going on somewhere, and so right now I'm planning to go to China over the summer for a couple weeks to do some more field work. My next book is I've started to work on it. I've got outline, and started to work on some chapters, but it's focused on late Paleolithic foragers of East Asia, and with the emphasis really on, because it seems like if you look at the modern human origins dispersal routes out of Africa, there was a second major dispersal that went over what's referred to as the northern route. And these guys split. They went north into Siberia, and then east into Siberia, and then west into Europe. And these are clearly modern human foraging groups that moved across, Siberia, came down into northern China, Mongolia, northern China, Korea, and Japan. And so, it got me interested to actually start looking at the combination of the archaeology, the skeletal biology, and what does the genetics say nowadays? Because I think that the picture is actually quite complicated regarding how modern humans moved across, across East Asia and arrived in these different locations. Because with the northern record and then the southern record is also not very clear at all. And so hopefully my book will bring some clarity to that.
Professor Christopher Bae, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Mark, for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation.